In this tutorial, I'll show you how to track graphics to this hat. This tutorial assumes you've never used Lockdown before. To get started quickly, apply the effect under Vranos, Lockdown. For the point track method, choose Connected Vectors, Extremely Accurate, and press Full Vector Setup. Press Render. Those vectors are rendered. When I return to my main composition, you'll notice that vector composition has been replaced with an EXR pass. Right-click it, reveal it in the project, right-click, go to Interpret Footage, Main, Color Management, Preserve RGB. Now back in Lockdown, you can add points in track. To add points, Control-click and drag to place many points. Control-click to place points individually. Press Track All. This is the track. You'll notice that many of the points get lost off the top of the frame because this is the edge of the video. You can use Interpolate Partial Tracks to attempt to automatically solve this. Auto-triangulate your mesh. Then press Lockdown. The script makes some changes to the composition. You'll notice your background here. You'll notice this current layer with Lockdown has a checkerboard on it. And there's a non-visible layer here which contains your graphics. Let me play this back first. You can see that the mesh is attached to the hat. And to change your graphics, go into the stabilized comp. I'll hide this checkerboard. This is the stabilized video playing back. And now whatever you put on this stabilized video will show up in your main comp. I actually have graphics here. I'll change the transfer mode on my Lockdown layer to multiply. And the graphics have been attached. That's a very fast overview for those of you who want to get started as quickly as possible. Now I'm going to go through this step by step with all the details you'll need. I'm going to undo everything, remove my graphics, delete Lockdown and reapply it. For one final note about setup, the video layer that Lockdown is on has to be the same resolution and frame rate as the composition it's in, with no time remapping. If you're at all unsure of how to set that up, just apply Lockdown to your layer and press this Pre-Compose button, which will place Lockdown in that layer and ensure it's the same resolution and frame rate as the composition. Otherwise, you can skip that step. Now let's look at everything with a lot of detail. The first parameter is lasso grid pixel distance. So when I create these points, it's going to create them 50 pixels apart. And of course, I could make this number smaller, and it will create them closer and larger for farther. You can alt-click and drag to delete points within a shape. I would recommend using the least amount of points possible to define your mesh and only adding them as needed. The default track mode is accurate. However, I'm going to show you what happens on a shot like this using the accurate track mode. The advantage is that this processes very quickly and you don't have to pre-compute vectors. However, admittedly, this tracker is just not very good. And it's not tracking the whole image, it's tracking each point individually, so it gets confused often when you have textures that have a lot of areas that look the same. This track mode is great for a shot that has very simple movement without a lot of other areas that look very similar. So for a shot like this, the default tracker would be great and very fast. So the short answer is, only use the default tracking mode when you have a simple shot. To delete all these points, I'll use Select All Points, and then I'll alt-click one of them, and that will delete everything. So reiterating, the best method of tracking is to go to Connected Vectors, make sure it's set to Extremely Accurate, and press Full Vector Setup, and then Render. Going back into my main comp, I just want to show what's happening here in more detail. this is your layer, and it has the Generate Vectors plugin applied to it. Now you can't actually see anything on here because the contrast is very low, but if I go to Effect, Color Correction, Levels, and I'll just estimate, I'll make this 0.498 and 1 minus 0.498, you can see there's actually a lot of detail in here, and it loosely mirrors the shape of whatever is being tracked. So I'll just duplicate this layer and delete the effects, and you can see that these vectors are pretty clearly following the motion that's in this shot. So I would recommend the first time you set up Generate Vectors to add some contrast and double check that you're seeing this. Also, it's super important that you hit Control K or Command K on Mac, and your background color is black. If it's any other color that you're using for another project, that's going to change the color of the vectors, and the tracking absolutely will not work. And worst of all, it's going to still take a long time to render. So just double check that. Make sure you don't have the levels on there, and then render this pass as we had seen before. In the render queue, this composition is going to be replaced with an EXR pass, as you'll see here. Under the output module, it's set to import and replace usage. So that's what's happening there, just so there's no confusion. So we'll just pretend that I actually rendered that, and that's what would result. And again, make sure that you set your footage to preserve RGB. I'll reconnect these vectors. I'll create some points. If we look at these tracking points closely, they have arrows pointing left and arrows pointing right. This means that these points will track to the left in time, left of the playhead, and to the right in time, right of the playhead. So actually, maybe for example's sake, I should create these on a more centered frame. And I'll select all of these at the bottom of the hat. And I'll press Set to Not Track, and then Set to Track Right, so you'll notice that these are only pointing to the right. And then I have these points up here. I'll press Set to Not Track and Set to Track Left. And then when I press Track All, which is the fastest way to track, you'll see the left arrow points, it tracks left of that time, and the right arrow points had tracked right of that time where we created them. If you have points that are incomplete, so for example, if we want these points to be tracking to the left now, because they'd only track to the right, we can select them, and we can press Set to Track Left, and then same with these other points, which had not tracked all the way to the right, we can select them, and press Set to Track Right, and then when we press Track All, now all the points are tracked throughout. One more thing that I'd like to point out is that Track All is the fastest way to track these points. However, it can be advantageous to manually track left and manually track right and watch the points as you track. So I'll press Track Right, and now I can just watch these track, and if any of them go astray, I can click and drag them back into place to correct them. In that case, nothing actually went astray. So I'll just move over to a project where I know something will, so we can show how to correct for that. So I'm going to place a point here on this bird's eye. Regardless of how it's set, it will track when selected. So I'll track right. And we'll just watch this for a second. And at this point, the track gets lost from this frame to this frame. So I'd recommend selecting the point on the last frame where it's good, and this creates an adjustment keyframe. You can see there's a crosshair here. This means that it's marking this position as a point chosen by the user, and we'll make sure it's pinpointed on here at this frame. Then I'll move to the next frame, and I'll just drag this into place. You'll also see, because I'm placing this manually, there's a crosshair. And then I'll continue to track right. So here's the track, and let's talk about how this point will render. When the track is solid, that's just a default track that hasn't been adjusted. When the track has an empty circle, that means that we're within 1 second of an adjustment keyframe. That's the crosshair we had just talked about. Right here. And on this crosshair is the actual adjustment keyframe. To delete a crosshair keyframe, you can press Delete Adjust Point, or you can delete the entire track of crosshair keyframes by pressing Delete Adjust Track. This tool can be used to quickly put your point back to where it's supposed to be. So for example, if we want this right on the corner of the eye through the whole shot. We can just play through it and drag this into place. This isn't retracking when you drag it into place. It's just doing an animated offset. While this moves pretty quickly with one point, I would highly recommend, after a point is tracked and adjusted correctly, pressing Bake Selected Tracks. You'll notice there are no more crosshairs or empty circles. This means that this keyframe track is just baked to actual keyframes. It will process much faster. The next thing to talk about is delete left keyframes and delete right keyframes. So I'm going to track part of the hat over here, knowing that this shadow is probably going to mess up some of these points. So I'll track right. So playing this back, you can see that most of these points are moving correctly, except there are 3 in there that are pretty tightly following that shadow. So what I would recommend for these points, if you had to track them, is for the frames that they work correctly. So we'll just start moving through here and say they look about good. And then they start to be influenced by the shadow maybe around right here. I would select these keyframes and press delete right keyframes. So these aren't going to show up for the rest of the shot. Actually, same with this one too. So I'll select this and delete right keyframes. Just double checking that the rest of these are pretty accurate. And a rule of thumb to lockdown is you should never have points that are tracking incorrectly. It's better that they just don't have keyframes over the time where they aren't tracking. So it's better that they just disappear here. So the question is, what happens to these points that just disappear? And how do we get these to just follow along with the rest of the mesh and the points around them? Well, there's a button here called Interpolate Partial Tracks. So again, playing through these points here, they disappear. But if I turn on Interpolate Partial Tracks, they're going to reappear, and they'll be dark blue, showing that they're just following along from the other points. And they'll attempt to follow the rest of the mesh. So you can see that these 4 points here work pretty well. And then it looks like this point is getting a little bit lost following the top of the hat. So we should delete those keyframes too. So I'll go back to the last frame where it was working. I'll select this point and I'll press delete right keyframes. If I play this forward, you'll notice that this one hasn't been interpolated correctly. That's because we need to recalculate the interpolation. So check this off and then check it back on. I notice that this point here is drifting along a little bit in ways that it shouldn't, so I'm actually just going to delete this. And then this can just connect straight down to here. You'll also notice with Interpolate Partial Tracks, it's very helpful when points go off screen. See, these points go off screen here, but then they come back on following these points that are remaining on screen. And actually, another thing you can do to help that out is you can add more points. For example, here, I'll just add a few points. And track these. And again, probably best to reset the interpolation, checking that off, then checking that back on. And you'll notice you're getting a pretty good track even when the points go off screen. The next step would be making any fine adjustments. So for example, where we saw with the bird, just using your adjust track on the interpolated points. So one of the strategies when I actually did this shot for the promotion was to make sure that each of these points was lined up on one of these rows for the hat. Here's the actual project file. And if you take a look, just putting all of these points on these lines made it much easier to organize this shot. And another thing I'd like to point out is you may notice some of these points in here that have no connections to the mesh. So for these gridded points, when I click and drag them, they are actually changing the mesh. But you'll notice there are a handful of points on here that are actually not connected. Well, these points were just created to help with the interpolation to guide my gridded points along. So they actually have no contribution to the mesh or the render. These are simply placed here because it made it so these points could interpolate and follow these when they went off screen. So for example, this point right here When this went off screen, it was helpful to have these points here that we're still tracking, so it would follow the motion somewhat and come back to where it was supposed to be. And then I went through the shot whenever these points came back into frame, and I lined them up perfectly on this line here, trying to follow some of the small details. That's just more of a note for how I finished this shot. Okay, moving back to the previous project. The next step would be to make a mesh. However, before that, I would suggest that if all of your points are looking good, and you think you won't be changing them anymore, just press select all points, and then bake selected tracks. And now these points are saved as keyframe tracks and will process much faster without interpolated partial tracks processing. Now we can press auto triangulate mesh. And I know that some of these areas logically don't make sense. So for example, here to here, we know that these points are not logically connected here. So it's better to just delete the edges that connect them. To delete edges, you can alt-click on an edge, which can be a little bit tedious. Or you can alt-shift-click and drag and draw a line through to delete all the edges in its path. So I would just go through and clean up the mesh in that way. And now we're ready to put a texture on here. So press lockdown. But before you do that, let's just make note of what's happening in our composition. We have our one layer with lockdown on it now, and we have our vectors. And when we press lockdown, it's going to create a couple of different layers. So first, let's just see what it did. You can see that there's a checkerboard attached to the hat. And now let's look at the composition structure. So the first thing this script did was it duplicated the layer which had lockdown on it. That's this one right here. And it just placed it at the bottom. And that's just because you need a background layer. So I'm going to turn the opacity down on that to 50% just for example's sake. And then the next layer is just the rendering of this mesh. So I'll just solo that. This is the layer that you've already been working on. This is the layer with lockdown on it. And the last layer is the stabilized layer, and this contains the checkerboard texture. So I'll just go into there. Here's the checkerboard texture, which is being composited over the mesh. And let's break down this composition as well. So I'll hide the checkerboard. The first layer in here, if you press U, you'll notice that it's a still frame, and it's on the frame on which we did the projection. So this is just the first frame. This is where we press the lockdown button, and this is the texture relative frame. The next layer here has lockdown on it, and it has all of your previous points, except this stabilized checkbox is checked. And if I play this, this is your video, except all of the points are being locked into place. So for example here, you'll notice at the top, this all looks like total nonsense. And that's because these points are actually out of frame up here. Just to really drive this point home, I'm going to duplicate this layer and I'll shut off stabilized and render points. And maybe I'll just try to hide the layer behind it. So this isn't something you have to worry about. I just wouldn't overthink this step with what I'm doing. So I just made a visualization of exactly what's happening here with our points. And you notice that all these points up here on that frame are out of the frame. So let me just delete these layers and go back to what we had. And that's why it's showing up like this with no texture, because there's no video to pull from, because those points are actually off the screen, and that's not a render error. It just doesn't have that information. So with these two layers, then comes the third layer, which is the checkerboard, which is totally deletable. So I'll just go ahead and delete that now. And now we can put our graphics in here. Don't feel intimidated by my graphic design skills. Someday with a lot of practice, you can make layouts that look as good as this. So as I played this over the stabilized, well, this isn't really going anywhere relative to the stabilized hat, and that's good, because this is a representation of how these graphics are going to be tracking back to the video. So I can hit tab and go back to this composition, and I'll just bring up the opacity of this background layer here. And you can see that these graphics are locked down. A very important concept to lock down is the stabilized frame. So when we press the lockdown button, we stabilized and based all the points and everything around this first frame, right? So these graphics are set up for this position here. And just to really drive this point home, I'm going to go into the stabilized comp, and I'm going to move this lockdown graphic to the very top of the mesh, to the very top of the hat. The top of the hat is appearing on this first frame. So now I'm going to move forward to where that's out of the frame. And with lockdown selected, we can undo our lockdown with the unlockdown button. And now I'll press lockdown again. And now you'll notice that my graphics are off. So just pressing this lockdown button, it really matters what frame you're pressing the button on. So I'm just going to make a marker down here to mark that. And if we go into our stabilized comp, the lockdown button actually updates. So for example, here where the top of the hat is out of the frame, now this is where it's going to stick down these graphics, the lockdown text, and track them to the hat. You'll also notice this bottom layer has been updated. This is where our still frame is. And we can play the stabilized. So the point I'm getting at is if you unlock down your composition, you need to make sure that if you've already started placing graphics, you press lockdown again on the first frame where you had previously pressed lockdown. So I can just press lockdown here. And now everything is back to normal. So why would you want to unlock down something? Well, that's in the case where you need to do more tracking. So you can press on lockdown, and then you can change around your mesh and refine things. It doesn't look like it matters for this shot because we have so many points. However, sometimes it helps when your mesh is made out of quads. So one of the reasons you might unlock down would be to just delete this strange array of points in here and try to make clean quads. To manually connect edges, select a point, hold down Ctrl-Shift, and then select another point. And again, you can alt-click to delete edges or to delete points. Alt-Shift-click. And delete several points by alt-clicking and dragging around them. I'll press lockdown again. And now the changes I've made have been updated. You'll notice that I took out part of the mesh here. And again, this lockdown instance is copied inside of your stabilized composition. So now you can see that this is outside of that mesh. So you could either add more points by pressing unlockdown and fixing that, or just moving this inside the boundaries of the mesh. The rest of these buttons aren't so important, but let's go over them anyway. Render points will just render your points so you can see them. Typically, I would just press unlockdown and let that handle this, but that's there if you need it. I wouldn't touch stabilized. I would allow the lockdown script and the unlockdown script to handle that. The point radius is pretty simple. It just makes these points bigger. This can be very helpful on 4K footage because this is a pixel size, not a percentage. Also very helpful if you have too many or too few points. If you have way too many points, you may want these to be much smaller. This also changes the line width. These two are not separatable, but that's probably okay. Select all points, obviously selects all points. And clear mesh will just remove your entire mesh. We'll come back to merge points. Let's look into externalize points. You only get 4 of them. You'll notice that all of these keyframes are buried and hidden inside of lockdown itself. So you can't actually adjust them. But what if you want to take one of these tracking points and get it out into After Effects and work with it? Well, you can grab any 4 points, so for example these 4, and you can press externalize selected points, then press U down here, and you'll see that these keyframe tracks have been brought out to points 1, 2, 3, and 4. And now if I create a null object, I can paste those keyframes to the position of the null object, and now I have these keyframes in the scene. And of course I can edit these points, and I'm just going to do so in a very gross way, just moving them down here. So now they're really just tracking nothing, but whatever. And then I can copy those. First you need to have an empty track in order to internalize points, so I would select all points and internalize, That's clearing this up right here. And now, going to the correct frame, I can take this keyframe data, copy and paste it. And it actually happens so fast that you can't see it, but it pastes the track and then it internalizes it. And now this point here is inside of lockdown. The reason why we hide all of our points inside the effect instead of exposing them is things just process much faster when we can hide them and manage them in our own way. There's a little bit of an overhead to keeping all of these points exposed in the After Effects UI. I'll delete this null object, we don't need it. Another thing that's very useful with these externalized points is getting points in from Mocha. So I use Mocha all the time, it's one of my favorite applications. I'll place this above lockdown. And one of the areas where Mocha can be very useful is tracking off the edges of a frame. So for example, another perfectly valid way to track the edges of this hat would be to do so in Mocha. I didn't really track this with a ton of precision, but to get these points back into lockdown from Mocha, you would show your planar surface, and these four corners are the ones that would come back in. So just scrubbing along, you can see that Mocha will do a good job taking this data down here and expanding this plane out of bounds. So if I wanted to get these back into lockdown, I'll just save here. And then go to tracking data, create tracking data, choose the layer, press OK. And now these are exposed in Mocha as top left, bottom right. And then in lockdown, there's actually a button at the top, Mocha Face Tracker Import. And I'll press that. And now you'll see these 4 points that were in Mocha are now in here. And these can be connected to the mesh as well. And are part of lockdown. You probably won't ever need to use this next control, the internal keyframe time ref. The lockdown script handles this on its own. I'll just press U so I can expose that, and I'll just remove Mocha for now, so it's not in the way. This is how our keyframes know where they are in time. So this is placed somewhere every time you track, and then all these keyframes, the internalized keyframes that aren't exposed, have their time relative to this. So if I were to move this, crazy things would happen. So this is just completely offset in time now. So in short, just don't touch that. Let lockdown handle that. However, it's good to know in case there's any sort of troubleshooting, where maybe somehow this keyframe gets moved accidentally, you know what it is and you know that you have to move it back until all of your points realign. The next thing to look at is our paint workflow. I'm sorry I'm making goofy faces here, but I wanted to move the wrinkles here and show you how to paint out this smiley face and this scar. Kill it with fire. Okay, so first thing is to place your tracking points. You want to keep them concentrated around the areas that you're going to paint. However, you also want areas that you can clone stamp from, so you'd probably go even a little bit wider here to maybe sample over from this patch of skin, or maybe sample over from this patch of skin for that part. However, for this example, just because we have no reason not to, I'm just going to track pretty much all of myself here. And we'll see what happens. Let's see that track. Looks pretty good. Sorry to keep going off on a tangent, but this shot tracks pretty well, and that's because I shot it on a really nice camera with a ton of bit depth and no compression. So if we go through and we look at the fine detail, I'm just going to turn on the optional tracking filter here, and I'll hide lockdown. There's tons of data in the skin pores here. Even though you can't really see it when you're watching the shot without the contrast filter, this is only possible because this shot had next to no noise and really great detail. So don't expect to get this kind of tracking results if you're just grabbing an MP4 online. Try to shoot with as little compression as possible. So I'll just delete this optional tracking filter. And I'll triangulate my mesh. And press lockdown. To paint this, we have to go into the stabilized composition. Again, we can delete this checkerboard. And let's see what this looks like stabilized. It'll probably look pretty crazy. I'm going to frame this and put it on my wall. And now we really just have to paint. So I'll go to any old frame. For example, this one here. And this is the stabilized layer. You'll notice that it's set to a guide layer, because in most cases people aren't painting, but in this case we are. So let's just make this not a guide layer so we can actually paint on it. Grab your clone stamp tool, double click on the layer, and then just clone stamp out the marker. And just for example's sake, I'm just going to take out some of these freckles. Not that there's anything particularly wrong with my freckles, but just to kind of prove the point that we can paint whatever inside of this stabilized comp. Actually, maybe this whole area. So let's see that toggled on and off. And now we need to make sure that our paint strokes persist all the way through the shot. You'll notice that that's not visible moving backward. So I'll select all of these, drag this back, and I'll play back the stabilized. Well, you can see it looks pretty good up here where we remove this marker and that marker. Down here, that looks pretty bad. So rather than overthink that, I'm just going to remove those paint strokes. And let's go back into our composition from layer mode and move back into our main composition. So you'll notice that paint has tracked because we painted on the stabilized and now is removed. And now the marker has been painted out in the main shot. Another thing you'll notice is there's a faint black outline. This is honestly a bug in Lockdown, which we just haven't addressed because it's so easy to fix and we've been so focused on other things. If you go into your stabilized background here, that's an issue where this edge is slightly black on the stabilized layer. And the easiest solution to that is just go to Effect, Matte, Simple Choker, and choke it like 3 pixels. And now that's gone. And side by side, you can see the original and you can see the paintwork. The last thing to look at is using the After Effects built-in face tracker. To do this, start by drawing a mask loosely around the face. Right-click the mask, go to Track and Stabilize, and choose Track Mask. For Method, choose Face Tracking Detailed Features, and track forward. You should delete the mask that's on this layer. And you can play back the shot and see how the points tracked.
The face tracker's 25 points are consistent across the whole shot, which is extremely helpful for guiding any partial tracks generated by Lockdown. Between the two methods, you can get great results much faster.
So like I said in this video from a couple months ago, the results aren't totally perfect, but they are a great starting point, and the eyes and eyebrows and nose are pretty much fantastic using this method. These act as a great supplement to your other tracks. Thanks for watching. For more info, check out aescripts.com/lockdown.